Hi everybody. I guess it's about time I made another video to show you what's going on here at Camp Serendipity. And what's going on is that I finally have resumed normal construction after being delayed about a year because of that tree that fell through the roof, punched a big hole in it. Took 5 months to repair the hole, and then since then I've spent most of my time logging so that it'll prevent that from happening again. And so for a while now I've been back to work on the ceilings, which is the project that got interrupted. And that is putting these pine boards on the ceilings. I just have this section left to go. It's roughly a quarter of the inside, and I have all the outside done. And in this video I want to show you some of my success and one big mistake that I made that is one of the most consequential mistakes I made in the whole project. And I'll show you the result of that, and then I'll show you what I have to do about it. First of all, let me explain the type of roof that I have. This might apply to you in your building or it might not. But I chose to use normal TJI rafters on 16-inch centers with pine boards nailed underneath for the ceiling. Now that's a departure from the recommendation of the Log Home Builders Association, of which I'm a proud member. But my reasons for doing that is that when I went to build my cabin, I hit the log market at the very worst time, and I had one heck of a time even finding logs at all. And to find enough straight logs for rafters would be impossible. As it was, I couldn't even find the long logs that I needed for this project, and so almost all of the long logs, that is the columns and purlins, beams and so on, came from this property. I harvested them myself. So using this type of ceiling, it's a lot slower than LHBA's method because you have to do a lot of the work from underneath. In particular, you have to insulate underneath after you have the sheeting on and the roofing, and then you have to put these pine boards on from underneath. So I needed to build or use a lot of scaffolding, and the scaffolds to reach the peak in the living room were 3-tier towers like this. And then from the loft, only 1 or 2 tiers. Now this part of the roof that I have left to do is a lot lower, so I can reach most of it, the bottom part of it, with no scaffolding at all. And then for the higher part, all I need is 1 tier of scaffolding, but I don't even put the platform at the top. I just put the platform in the middle. So that makes that simpler. But the problem that I was going to explain, the mistake I made, was that I made this column too long by about a ½ inch, maybe 3/4. And at that time there were no floors, and so it's 20 feet from here down to the dirt or the rocks, and that was all open at the time, just the beam structure and the columns. So it was quite a trick to even get this log up and in place, and when I tried to put it in place, it didn't fit. And rather than doing more careful measurements and making sure it was the right length, I thought that it didn't fit just because it was slanted. The bottom was in place, and then the top had to move over to go in place, and I thought it was just that corner effect that made it seem too long, and that once it squared up, then it would settle, it would be the right height, because I trusted my measurements. So I used a sledgehammer to just pound it into place. Well, what I did inadvertently by doing that was to deflect that purlin on top. That purlin, big as it is, actually bowed up about a ½ inch as a result of that hammering. And at the time I didn't realize that, and my mistake was not checking it with a tight string to see if it was still straight. Instead I just left it. And I didn't discover it until I started installing rafters. And I started installing rafters on that wall. I installed the rafters in pairs. I'd bring up a 40-foot rafter to go down that ceiling and a 24-foot rafter on this side, and then I'd put them in pairs so that I could join them at the peak and march them across the building in that direction. So in that corner they fit. By fit, I'll show you what I mean by that. What I mean is that the rafters come down and meet this board. This is one of my ceiling boards that was installed on top of this purlin or cap log right after it was installed. First this log was installed, then this board was nailed on top, then the rafters go on top of that board. And I did that with all the purlins. Now the rafter has to bear on the ridge pole up there in the middle, and then this purlin mid-span, and this purlin at the end. So there are 3 points it has to bear on, and if those aren't in a straight line, then it doesn't work very well. But that was in a straight line and it fit. But then I discovered when I get to this next rafter, it wasn't exactly a good fit. I needed a little bit of a shim there, and so I put a little bit of a shim in there. The next rafter I find out, I need a little bit bigger shim. So by this time I'm shimming up 1/4 inch. And then by the time I get to this rafter, I'm shimming about 1/2 inch. And about that time I started wondering what is going on. And so I did some careful measurements, and I discovered that the purlin was bowed up because of the problem I just told you about. So now what to do? I could either dismantle the 7 or 8 sets of rafters that I already installed, which didn't appeal to me, and then I could have maybe done something about shortening this column and getting that deflection out of the beam. But instead I decided what I'll do is keep the ridge straight. So keep the rafters exactly in a straight line over the peak. Otherwise roofing would be a terrible problem. And then since this bows up in the middle, it just means that the roof is going to have a bow in it, and that bow is going to be twice as big in the middle down there as it is here, because, or even more, because this column is not quite halfway to the wall. And so in the middle the error is about 1.5 inches. So I resigned myself, all right, I'll just have that bow in it. It's going to affect a few things, but I just shimmed up 1.5 inches all the way across. But then it goes back down to 0 on the other wall. Well, now how do you fix that? How do you put the ceilings in? And what I decided to do was to install shims that would be thick enough at the butt end of the shim to take up whatever space I needed. And that way the ceiling boards could still engage tongue to groove in that straight ceiling board that's nailed on top of the wall that's there already. And then it'll gradually move up to meet the rafters, so that once it gets past the shim, then the ceiling boards will bow right with the rafters and have a continuous ceiling. So I measured all the gaps that I needed for shims, and then I designed or I planned for cutting them out. So these are the shims I need. Just use a couple of scrap 2x4s, and I'll take my saw and cut these shims out, nail them up one shim against each rafter, and then I'll nail the ceiling boards to those. Now, I've got experience doing that because on the other side of the wall is the outside eaves, with exactly the same problem for exactly the same reason. And so I did that when I installed the ceilings on the outside of the building, which I did first. So that's done, it worked, proof of concept, so now I'll do it again in the inside. So the next step, I'll cut these apart, make shims out of them, bring them up here, nail them in, and then start nailing the ceiling boards. Okay, I just finished cutting all the shims. We're in a pile. Now I'll sort them by length. Now, after a couple of corrections, we have our shims ready for nailing, and they're lined up in sequence. Number one. Number two. For these thin ones, a stapler works better than a hammer. Four. Five. The staples will hold them. Now I'll nail them. for the rest of them, I have to go out on that scaffold tower, so I'll move over there. Okay, shims are all done. We're ready for the first course of ceiling boards. I just have to get down off of here. Okay, we're finally ready to start nailing the first course of boards on this section of the ceiling, the last section. And I'm going to start with a short one because this one's a little special. It has to seat in this pocket that's always a little tight and special. And then it has to go around an electrical box, and I've cut out the notch for that. And I've tried this dry and it fits. So now I just put a little caulk on the end of this to make that joint tight inside, and then we'll nail it in place. seated properly all the way. Now just a matter of nailing it in. Alright, first ceiling board is in place. There are 2 courses of boards in place now. It'll be fairly routine from here. But right now I'm going to stop nailing and go outside and do some digging, backfill my waterline trench before the bugs come out too much. So that's it for this video, and thanks for watching. Check out my website, paulandellen.com. and subscribe to this channel if you like these. Thanks.